Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shiloh, Rabbi David Bar Hayim. Shalom, Harav Bar Hayim.
Shalom.
There's a widespread presumption in the Torah world that the Shulchan Aruch binds us all and was accepted by Am Yisrael, by the Jewish people. What does the Rav have to say about this matter?
Many years ago, I heard on the radio a certain well-known Rav speak at a certain conference, gave a shiur, in which he explained that in his view, the Shulchan Aruch, the halachic code known as the Shulchan Aruch, is binding and obligates all Jews to follow its halachic rulings. Why? Because the Jewish people accepted the Shulchan Aruch, which, if you think about it, of course, is a somewhat circular argument. It obligates the Jewish people because the Jewish people accepted it. But we will return to that point in a moment. He based this argument on a statement that he quoted from the Rambam. Rambam writes in his Hakdama, in his introduction to his halachic code, the Mishneh Torah, that the Jewish people accepted those things, all those things written in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, and therefore those things are binding. And in the same way, this particular rabbi expressed his view that the Shulchan Aruch is therefore also binding in the same way. My understanding is that all of this is a fallacy. First of all, if we return for a moment to Rambam and what he writes in his introduction, one has to take note of the fact that, first of all, Rambam begins with the fact that the Torah consists of a Torah shebichtav and a Torah she'ba'al peh, a written Torah and an oral tradition, and this was passed down from generation to generation from the time that the Torah was given to the Jewish people, well over 3,000 years ago. And he goes on to list, actually, generation by generation, name by name, the prophets and the sages of the Jewish people who received this tradition and passed it on from one generation to the next. The Rambam considers this to be so important that he does it, in fact, in both directions. He counts from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses, down to the redactor or supposed redactor of the Talmud Bavli, Rav Asher, and then he does the same thing in the opposite direction, from Rav Asher to Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore he explains that because the literature that we have from Chazal, from the sages, which includes the Mishnah and both Talmudim, the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, and the Tosefta and the different Baraitot like the Mechilatan, the Sifrei, etc., all this material that we have from the Tanaim and the Amoraim, this represents the views and the opinions and the discussions of the overwhelming majority of the great sages of Torah of the Jewish people at that time, when they were still able to discuss these matters amongst themselves, because they were more or less concentrated in one or two geographical areas, that is to say, in Eretz Yisrael or Bavel, in Babylon. And these discussions and opinions were recorded because these people were those who received this tradition and knew the Torah, and there were no serious and well-known Torah sages who were not included in these discussions and whose opinions do not appear in this literature. Therefore, this book, or this collection of books, is authoritative and binding. What the Rambam actually is saying is that just as when a person wants to know what to do about a certain medical problem that he has, he turns to a doctor because the doctor knows more about medicine than he does, or alternately, if you need something fixed in your home, you turn to a person who knows how to fix it, because apparently you do not, otherwise you would do it yourself. In the same way, when a Jew wants to know what does the Torah say about something, what is the instruction and the direction that the Torah gives us, one turns to the experts in Torah, and those experts are Hazal, and their opinions, therefore, should guide us. And this is common sense when one thinks about it. If the Jewish people wanted, and they certainly did want, to know how to live as Jews and how to maintain their connection to the Torah and to Hashem, and guarantee the continued existence of the Jewish people into the future, if they wanted to know these things, they naturally turned to the sages, the Torah sages and scholars, both of earlier times and of their own time. It is for this reason that Rambam explains that the works of Hazal are authoritative. It is only at that point that Rambam adds the statement that the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, was accepted by the Jewish people, and therefore everything that appears there is binding. Frankly and strictly speaking, this statement of Rambam is not historically precise, nor is it actually intellectually convincing. It's not convincing intellectually, first of all, because it is not the fact that if something is accepted by a person or by a group of people, that thing is necessarily correct. Many views and ideas and opinions have been accepted by many people, sometimes by the entire world, at different points in history, such as the notion, for example, that the earth is flat, and yet we all know the earth is not flat. The notion that the earth is at the center of the universe, or the solar system at least, was also understood to be a fact by humanity for a very long period of time, and yet it is not so. The fact that the Jewish people accept something, that itself can't be an argument for something being true or authoritative. There has to be more to it than that, and the Rambam himself told us that there is more to it than that. They accepted the works of Hazal because those people are the experts who are knowledgeable and have the training and the experience to express views on matters relating to Judaism and Torah. The Rambam refers there to the Talmud Bavli because, as we know, in ancient times, 2,000 years ago, or more precisely 1,800 years ago and 1,500 years ago, there were two centers of Torah learning in the Jewish world. One center was in, of course, the land of Israel, and the other was in Bavel, in Babylon. And due to historical developments, that is to say, the Roman and later Byzantine persecutions of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, the Jewish presence in the land of Israel dwindled over a period of centuries, and the Torah academies, the yeshivot, also therefore became smaller and less significant and eventually disappeared altogether. And during that same period of time, in Bavel, in Babylon, the Jews lived for the most part under peaceful conditions. They enjoyed an autonomous rule under the exarch, the Resh Galutha, the Rosh HaGalut, the head of the exile. They had many great yeshivot which only increased in size and in strength and in wisdom. And this is at a time when the, as we said, the Romans, the Byzantines, and later the Muslim conquest of Eretz Israel caused, to a large extent, the destruction, the devastation of the land of Israel and the expulsion of its Jewish inhabitants. At the same time, in Babylon, the Muslim authorities, first of all, the Romans and the Byzantines never controlled Babylon, and second of all, later, under the Muslim Caliphate, the Jews were able to live their lives as Jews, and Torah study flourished. As a result of this historical reality, which was an evolutionary process over a period of generations, the center of gravity in the Jewish world and the Torah world shifted from Eretz Israel to Bavel. And as a result, and this is the true reason as opposed to other suggestions that have been made, as a result of this, the Talmud Bavli, that is to say, the Talmud which sums up all the opinions and discussions of the sages in the yeshivot of Bavel, that became the standard text for the Jewish people. It was disseminated throughout the world. You have to keep in mind also the fact that during this period, the period of the Geonim, we're talking about the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries and even beyond, the power of the Muslim Empire, which had its capital in Baghdad, was very great, was immense in fact. It was the largest and most powerful, the richest empire in the world. It was the center of international finance, just as perhaps Manhattan is today. So was Baghdad in those days. All roads led not to Rome but to Baghdad. And it's interesting and relevant to note that the famous yeshiva in Bavel called Surah because it was actually situated in a town, a satellite town of Baghdad called Surah, which is just a short distance from Baghdad, was right there next to the capital, the seat of power, the seat of government of the Muslim Empire. It was in the interests of the Caliphate to have the center of the Jewish world under its own control and dominion. This only increased the power and the influence of the Muslim regime and the Arab Empire, so that Jews throughout the world were linked to the center of gravity of Jewish affairs in Bavel, and in such a way, by way of trade routes, many merchants who traveled backwards and forwards bringing expensive and rare items from the East to Europe, etc. The Babylonian Talmud and Babylonian traditions and minhagim, customs, became the norm in the Jewish world. And this was in fact the reason why the Talmud Bavli became the more dominant text. There was never any decision on the part of the Jewish people or any particular group of Jews or even one isolated community to accept this or that book. It was simply a process of osmosis, a process of gradual influence caused for the reasons that we mentioned. One can prove this very simply by pointing to the fact that as late as the 14th century, we see clear references in rabbinic literature to the fact that there were communities of Jews who maintained halakhic practices and customs and prayer liturgy not based on the Babylonian model. And they were sometimes castigated for this fact because other authorities had a vested interest. The Babylonian authorities certainly had such a vested interest in forcing their position, their view, their liturgy, their customs and their halakhic practices on the entire Jewish world. There was always a lot of tension between the two Torah centers in Eretz Yisrael and Bavel, and over time the Babylonian center won that particular battle for the historical reasons that I mentioned, but not for any cogent Torah or intellectual reason. Of course, if one would say, the Rambam says that the Jewish people accepted such a thing, then we must ask ourselves, well, how exactly did this acceptance take place? In what form did this, and which way this happened? Did the Jewish people have a referendum? Was there a vote? Who voted exactly? The commoners? The average Jew? How can the average Jew express an opinion about what halakhic text to accept or not to accept? Did the rabbis of the Jewish world convene in one great convention to reach this decision? Of course not. We know none of these things happened, and none of these things could have happened. The simple fact is there was never any such decision. There was no conscious effort to decide the matter in any way. It wasn't a question of deciding. It was a question of influence and historical realities, the weight of historical facts, economic and military facts, the power of the Arab Empire, the Muslim Empire, which was able to make inroads into the entire Jewish world for the reasons that we explained. And therefore the Talmud Bavli became the basic handbook for the Jewish world. In my view, this battle is not over. The battle was won at that time by the Babylonian center. But as we know, there is no longer any Babylonian center, and Jewish history has taken a new course in our own times. And there's no question that Eretz Yisrael is now the center of the Jewish world, and will, B'ezrat Hashem, remain so. And just as there were tensions and struggles in this regard in the past, so there will be in the future. So, to return to the topic at hand, the claim that a book such as the Talmud Bavli is authoritative because it was accepted by the Jewish people is a very childish and unintellectual approach and understanding of what actually happened. And therefore the claim that the Shulchan Aruch is such a book because it was accepted by the Jewish people is also equally childish and unrealistic. One could ask the same questions that I asked before about the Talmud. How exactly was the Shulchan Aruch accepted? Did the Jewish people vote? Did the rabbis of the Jewish world discuss it? How did this come about? If one examines the Shulchan Aruch, one will quickly discover that as we have the book before us, it really consists of two parts. The part written by the original author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was a Sfaradi, and the annotations that were added at the same time, within a generation of the book first appearing, by the Ashkenazi sage Rabbi Moshe Isserles. The first printing of the Shulchan Aruch with both these parts of the work printed together was printed in the year Shin Mem 1580. If one examines the halachic approach of these two Chachamim, one discovers a very simple thing, and that is that both of these Chachamim are not, for the most part, deciding halachic issues on their own, based on their own analysis and reasoning and understanding. They are essentially quoting earlier authorities, each from their part of the world, from those countries, authorities that lived in those countries from which they themselves came, which are a reflection of what the standard halachic practice of the Jews were in these countries at that time. In other words, Rabbi Yosef Karo, a Sfaradi, for the most part relies on the opinions of halachic authorities like the Rif, the Rambam, the Rashba, and others, who were all Sfaradim and whose views had become the accepted approach and practice in the Sfaradi lands, where Sfaradi Jews resided. And the Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, did exactly the same. He lived in Poland, in Krakow. He did exactly the same for the Ashkenazi Jewry. He recorded the opinions and the views of those great Torah sages, medieval sages such as the Tosafot and Marami Rothenburg and the Rosh, whose opinions had become standard practice in Ashkenazi countries. So, in fact, what we have here is not a book which consists of halachic decisions so much as a book which is essentially a snapshot, an halachic snapshot of reality at that time in different parts of the Jewish world. It is almost as if Rabbi Yosef Karo took out a camera and took pictures in order to record the halachic reality in his part of the world, and Rabbi Moshe Isserles did exactly the same thing in Poland and recorded the views and the opinions that were standard in his part of the world. It obviously, therefore, goes without saying that this book was accepted, so to speak. The word accepted, of course, in inverted commas. Because if a book simply tells you that this is what we do and therefore you should continue doing it, well, of course everyone will accept it. No one will have any problem with such a book. An halachic code which comes along and says this is what you should do, even if it's not what you have been used to doing till now, such a book will, of course, frequently, if not almost inexorably and without exception, such a book will encounter opposition from different quarters. But a halachic code which simply states this is what we do in this part of the world, and the other half of the same book tells you, well, this is what we do in this part of the world, of course that is a perfectly innocuous and readily accepted work which can function as a kind of basic text for all Jews all over the world, because it involves no decision making and no no departure from accepted practice. And this is why the Shulchan Aruch became a standard and commonly accepted book of halachic practice. But that doesn't imply or prove that the Shulchan Aruch is in any way superior to other halachic texts, or that the opinions recorded therein are necessarily more correct than other opinions that may exist and for whatever reason were not recorded in the Shulchan Aruch.
Thank you, Harav Baruch Hayim. A word to our viewers. If you would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with Harav Baruch Hayim in honor or memory of a loved one, or if you would like to order a Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.